The morning train hissed and groaned to a halt in the fog-draped station, its wheels squealing like some wounded animal reluctant to stop. From one of the rear cars, a tall black man stepped down, his Union Army coat faded to gray and his boots cracked with travel. In his hand, he clutched a cloth bundle, but it wasn't the weight of that bundle that curved his shoulders. It was time. Time and memory. The man's name was Elias Carter, and he'd carried that same worn piece of fabric with him since the day he left Georgia as a boy torn from the only family he had ever known. He didn't pause long at the station. No one offered a welcome, nor did he expect one. Around him, the town limped through reconstruction, like a man learning to walk again after being broken. The war was over, they said, but for men like Elias, it hadn't truly ended. Not when your sister's face still lived in your dreams, and your promise to find her clung to your ribs tighter than any uniform. The streets were muddy and uneven buildings, either rebuilt in haste or left crumbling as if ashamed of their past. The few white folks who walked by gave Elias the kind of glance that lingered too long, not outright hostile, but not kind either. It was the look given to free black men in a world that still hadn't made peace with the word free. Elias didn't care. Not about their stares, not about the ache in his back or the uncertainty clawing at his chest. He was chasing a rumor, a whisper really, that a colored woman had started teaching children to read in a wooden shack just outside the old district. Most folks thought it nonsense. Who'd let a Negro woman teach anything someone had said when Elias asked about her at a general store 2 towns over? But he clung to it anyway, because the woman's name was Sarah. He passed a church with no steeple, a saloon that hadn't changed since he was a child picking cotton nearby. Every turn was a battlefield between past and present, and everywhere he looked he wondered, had Sarah walked here once? Had her hands touched this same fence post, this same door frame, this same patch of Georgia dirt? The road to the school was nothing more than 2 ruts carved into the clay by wagon wheels. Trees arched overhead like old ghosts bowing to greet him. And then just beyond a crooked fence, he saw it, a one-room building with peeling white paint and a crooked bell tower. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the air, high and bright like birdsong. It made something tighten in Elias's throat. He stopped short of the porch. Through the window, he saw her standing at the front of the class chalk, in hand eyes alight with something fierce and gentle all at once. She was older now, of course, taller, her hair tied back in a bun. But Elias would have known those eyes anywhere. His breath caught. For a moment, the world narrowed to that room, that woman, that heartbeat, Sarah. He whispered it like a prayer, but he didn't go in. Not yet. He watched as she turned toward the chalkboard and wrote the alphabet, her hands steady, her posture proud. The children, mostly barefoot, sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to every letter she etched. It hit Elias then, not just that she had survived, but that she had become. In a land that tried to keep folks like them beneath the dust, she had risen, not to escape it, but to teach others how to walk through it. His fingers brushed the cloth bundle in his coat. It was all he had left from that day long ago, a handkerchief once white, now stained by blood, earth, and time. 2 initials had been stitched on its corner in the shaky thread of a child E&S. He stepped back from the window. His legs felt heavy, like he'd just marched 50 miles all over again. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined, tears, embraces, recognition. She hadn't seen him yet. Maybe she wouldn't remember. Maybe time had buried him in her mind the way it tried to bury hope in places like this. Still, he smiled. She was alive. She was here. And that was more than any soldier dared ask for after war. He turned away from the schoolhouse and walked down the path, leaving no footprints in the red Georgia clay. The promise had brought him this far. Tomorrow he would step through that door and say her name aloud. But today he needed only one thing to know: she still had a voice, and that she was using it to change the world. The next morning, Elias stood at the edge of the clearing again, watching the children spill into the yard like laughter made flesh. Some carried old slates, others just scraps of paper. Their voices lifted in rhythm with the rising sun. He waited until they had filed inside before stepping forward. This time he didn't stop at the window. His boots crunched softly on the porch boards as he climbed the 3 worn steps. He hesitated at the door. Inside, he could hear her voice, clear, warm, commanding, in a way that made children sit straighter. It had that same tone their mother once had when reciting psalms over supper or calling them in from the fields. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, the memory bittersweet as smoke. Then he knocked. The room fell silent. He heard her footsteps approach, then the creak of the door opening. She stood there framed by soft sunlight and chalk dust. Her eyes searched his face with polite confusion. Yes, she asked, voice cautious but not unkind. Elias took off his hat, lowering his gaze just slightly. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I'm looking for someone I once lost." She blinked. "You must be mistaken." "I'm not," she stopped herself, looked him over. "Do I know you?" He wanted to say yes. God, how he wanted to say yes. But her face, though so achingly familiar, held nothing but distance. No spark of recognition, no tremble of memory surfacing from the deep. And just like that, the air between them felt too wide to cross. I may be mistaken," he murmured. "I'm sorry for disturbing your class." He turned to go, his heart dragging behind him. But before he stepped off the porch, he reached into his coat and pulled out the bundle, the old handkerchief, and placed it gently on the wooden bench outside the door. "I believe this belongs to someone named Sarah," he said without looking back. "Maybe you'll know what to do with it." Then he walked away down the same red path, the trees closing around him once more. Inside the schoolhouse, Sarah stood frozen. The children waited wide-eyed, sensing something just beyond their understanding. She picked up the cloth slowly. The moment her fingers touched the frayed fabric, something sparked beneath her ribs. She turned it over. Her breath caught. E and S. The initials were small, nearly faded into the weave, but unmistakable. Her legs gave out and she sank onto the bench, the handkerchief clutched to her chest. She remembered. Not clearly at first, more like fragments, a muddy road, a brother's embrace, the sound of chains, the panic of being pulled away screaming his name. And then that promise, whispered through bars, through distance, through time. "I'll find you." Tears slid down her cheeks as the children inside fell into a soft, confused silence. She looked toward the path he had taken. It was empty now, but she could still feel the weight of his presence, still hear the quiet grief in his voice. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat by the small lamp, unfolding every corner of memory she had forced herself to forget just to survive. In the mirror, she didn't see the schoolteacher anymore. She saw the little girl who used to braid her brother's hair and count stars with him from a dirt patch behind the slave quarters. By morning, she was waiting by the road. Elias didn't expect to see her. He had spent the night lying on a cot in an abandoned stable, watching the rafters shift in moonlight, replaying every word he hadn't been able to say. But when he turned that final bend toward the town's edge, there she was standing still, her dress catching the breeze, the handkerchief folded neatly in her hands. She didn't speak right away. Neither did he. And then in a voice that cracked like the first thaw after a long winter, she said, "You found me." He swallowed hard. "I promised I would." She stepped forward slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too fast. Then with no ceremony, no fanfare, she wrapped her arms around him. Not the careful embrace of strangers or the polite hug of acquaintances, but the full, desperate, shaking embrace of blood reunited. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, she looked up at him, eyes glistening. "You've changed." "So have you," he said with a smile. "But not your voice. I'd know it anywhere." She laughed through her tears. "And you still talk too slow?" He chuckled, then glanced toward the little schoolhouse. "You teach now?" She nodded. Someone had to. They don't know the world wants them dumb. Elias looked at the children inside their faces, pressed against the windows, grinning. "Well," he said, "maybe they'll let me learn something too." And just like that, they walked back toward the classroom together. They crossed the threshold of the schoolhouse as if entering a sacred space, one rebuilt not with stone or wealth, but with memory and defiance. The children scattered back to their seats, their faces lit with curiosity, excitement, and the kind of wide-eyed awe reserved only for stories and people that feel larger than life. Sarah resumed her place at the front of the room, while Elias took a quiet seat in the back, his broad shoulders easing down as though for the first time in years, he no longer had to stand watch. The lesson resumed, but something had shifted. Sarah's voice was warmer, fuller now, like a chord finally harmonizing with its missing note. Elias watched not as a soldier or a man, scarred by the weight of history, but as a brother discovering the woman his little sister had become, a woman who commanded a room with gentleness, who carved hope into a world that had tried to crush it beneath boots and silence. Later that day, when the last child ran out into the sunlight, Sarah lingered by the windows, her fingers absently wiping away chalk from the edge of her skirt. Ilias rose, slowly stretching the weariness from his legs, and stepped outside with her. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was a fragile, sacred thing, filled with all the words they hadn't spoken yet. "You stayed alive," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the truth of it. "I had to," Elias answered. "I couldn't break the promise. Not to you." She nodded but didn't meet his gaze. "Sometimes I told myself you were dead. It was easier than hoping, easier than wondering if you'd just forgotten me." He didn't flinch, though her words struck like a blow. "I never forgot," he said steady and low. "I never could." They walked the short distance to the small cabin she lived in. 2 rooms, bare wood floors, a crooked table in the corner, but it was hers. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the scent of dried herbs hung in the air. As Sarah ladled soup into 2 chipped bowls, Elias glanced at the simple shelf lined with books. He reached for one, a volume of old sermons, its spine cracked, but pages clean. "You always did love reading," he said, smiling. "It kept me sane," she replied. "It was the one place I could go that the masters couldn't reach." They ate in silence for a while, but the quiet was different now, less about what was unsaid, more about what was understood. The way family can sit beside each other without filling every moment with words. When the meal was done, they sat by the fire, watching embers fall like tiny stars. Elias began to speak not of glory or victory, but of the long road back. He told her of the cold nights marching through Tennessee, mud of comrades who sang songs to drown out gunfire, of faces he remembered more clearly than names. He spoke of fear of blood, of the dull ache of survival. But most of all, he spoke of her, how the memory of her laugh, of her tiny hands wrapped around his pinky, had carried him through more battles than bullets ever had. Sarah listened with a stillness that came from living with ghosts. And when he finished, she didn't cry. She simply reached over, took his hand in hers, and held it tightly as if anchoring him back to this world. "You came back a soldier," she said softly, "but you never stopped being my brother." That night she offered him the cot near the hearth, and he accepted without protest. As the fire dimmed, they spoke in hushed voices, recalling memories like children swapping secrets under blankets. The night their mother hummed a hymn neither of them could quite remember. The tree they used to hide beneath during thunderstorms. The sweet taste of molasses stolen from the pantry. Small things yet, in the telling they became monuments. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it the scent of soil and smoke. And something else, something ancient and unspoken, like the earth itself, had paused to listen. Elias lay awake long after Sarah's breathing slowed into sleep. He stared at the flickering shadows on the ceiling, the quiet of the room wrapping around him like a second skin. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man passing through. He felt rooted, not just to the land or the cabin, but to her. She had survived, she had risen, and now maybe he could begin to live again. Morning crept in quietly, casting golden light across the floorboards of the small cabin, catching on the edge of Elias's worn boots, and creeping up the hem of Sarah's skirt, where she sat already awake grinding dried corn by hand. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving behind a soft bed of coals that glowed like the last embers of a storm survived. Elias rose slowly, joints stiff but heart lighter than it had felt in years, and for a while they didn't speak. There was no need to. The silence was easy now, anchored in the comfort of presence. The rhythm of their days began to settle into a quiet dance. Elias helped mend the fence behind the schoolhouse and chopped wood for the stove, while Sarah prepared lessons and kept the children's attention with nothing but her voice and the slow, deliberate sweep of chalk on slate. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch watching the sky fade into indigo, sometimes speaking of the past, more often just sitting shoulder to shoulder in a kind of shared breath. But even peace like this couldn't exist untouched. It began with a single word scrawled in black charcoal across the wooden door of the schoolhouse savages. No one had seen who did it. No one claimed to know, but everyone, black and white, understood exactly what it meant. Sarah scrubbed the door clean with lye water and sand, her knuckles raw by the end. Elias said nothing as he watched her, But that night he sat by the window of the cabin with his rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the tree line. He didn't sleep. A week later, a dead rabbit was nailed to the schoolhouse steps. Its blood had pooled in the dust, and the children had seen it before Sarah could sweep it away. The youngest cried. A few parents stopped sending their children altogether. Word spread fast in towns like this. Danger whispered on porches and behind curtained windows. Sarah refused to close the school. "They're trying to scare us," she said, jaw clenched as she stitched torn books back together at the table. "If we stop, they win." Elias didn't argue, but he reinforced the back windows and moved a cot into the schoolhouse. During the day, he stood nearby while she taught his presence a quiet shield. At night, he kept watch, eyes sharp and steady beneath the brim of his hat. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing a broken shutter, a stranger approached. A tall, lean white man with weathered skin and eyes like rusted steel. He introduced himself as Mr. Richmond, an old landowner who had once held slaves but claimed now to be a man of reason. "I heard what you're doing here," he said to Sarah, standing just outside the schoolhouse gate. "It's brave. Foolish maybe, but brave." She regarded him with the wariness of someone who'd had kindness offered like sugar before a switch. "Why are you here, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but unwelcoming. Mr. Richmond didn't flinch. "Because I've got lumber rotting behind my barn and a grandson who can't read. Thought maybe both might be useful to you." It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. By the end of the week, Elias and a few men from the community had used the donated wood to build a fence around the schoolyard. It wasn't high, but it marked the space as theirs, and that mattered. Still, the threats escalated. One night under a new moon sky, Sarah awoke to the sound of boots crunching dry leaves. Elias was already at the door, rifle in hand, breath steady. Outside, 5 men stood at the edge of the fence line holding lanterns and weapons. Their faces were shadowed, but their intent was not. "This is your only warning," one of them called out. "Shut it down, or we will." Elias stepped forward into the light, the muzzle of his rifle angled toward the earth, but ready. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, voice like stone dragged through gravel. "And I promise you, I've seen more death than you can count." A long, tense silence followed. Then one of the men spat into the dirt, turned and walked away. The others followed their departure, noiseless, but the threat lingered like smoke on the wind. When dawn broke, the children still came, and Sarah still taught. But now Elias stood at the door, not just as a brother or a veteran, but as a sentinel. And somewhere deep inside him, where the battlefield never truly faded, he knew this war was far from over. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. The air that morning carried a stillness that felt almost reverent, as though even the wind had paused to bear witness. The night had passed without incident, but no one mistook that for peace. In towns like this, silence was often the heaviest warning. Still, when Elias opened the schoolhouse doors at sunrise, he was greeted not by fear or hesitation, but by the steady stream of small feet crunching over gravel. Children arriving in 2s and 3s, clutching books and slates, like shields against a world that had already tried too hard to erase them. Some parents followed behind, not with words, but with nods, silent affirmations that they trusted this place, these walls, and the people inside them. And as the children settled into their morning lessons, a bouquet of wildflowers appeared on Sarah's desk. No note. No one claimed it. But the message was clear. We see you. We stand with you. Elias watched it all from the corner of the room, his hands folded loosely over his belt, the rifle still leaning quietly by the door. He wasn't sure when the fear had shifted into resolve, but he saw it now in the way the children laughed louder, in the way Sarah walked taller, in the way the townsfolk no longer crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Something was changing inch by inch, like grass pushing up through cracked stone, but change he knew was never free. Later that week, a man from the county office arrived, a sour-looking clerk in a stiff black coat, his boots too polished for a place still stitched together by calloused hands and sweat. He brought with him a stack of papers, a ledger, and a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been informed," he said with the precision of someone who didn't care to be there, "that this schoolhouse has no formal charter, no approved curriculum, and is not authorized to operate under county standards." Sarah stood beside the desk with her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "And which standard says these children don't deserve to learn their own names?" The clerk's smile faltered. "The law is the law," he replied. "Without proper credentials or oversight, this building can be ordered closed." Elias stepped forward, then not to threaten, but to stand. His presence alone seemed to fill the room with weight, with history, with the silent testimony of a man who had already fought for one freedom and would not stand idle while another was taken. The clerk left with no signature and no promise, but the danger was real. Bureaucracy, Elias realized, could wield silence as effectively as torches and ropes. That night, Sarah sat at the table, her fingers curled tightly around a pen, the ink well shaking slightly as she wrote. Elias watched from across the room, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. She was writing a letter to a woman she had once met from a northern society that supported schools for freedmen. The woman had promised aid books, perhaps even legal assistance. At the time, Sarah hadn't dared to believe her. But now hope was not a luxury, it was a requirement. Outside, the sound of hammers echoed in the dark. A few of the older boys from the community were helping Elias reinforce the back walls with extra planks and nails. Not because they expected violence that night, but because preparing meant they could breathe. As the days passed, something extraordinary began to take shape. More children came, some from 2, even 3 counties away. They arrived dusty and tired, but eager. One boy, no more than 9, carried a Bible so worn, its spine was held together with string. "My mama says if I can read God's word," he said shyly, "then I can read anything." Parents brought chickens, potatoes, sacks of cornmeal as thanks, whatever they had to give. One woman pressed a quilt into Sarah's hands, whispering, "This is for warmth, but also for covering should the cold come in unexpected ways." Elias stood outside one evening as the sun melted behind the hills, watching a father help his daughter trace letters in the dirt with a stick. The man's hands were rough-stained from work, but careful, like he was holding something sacred. Elias blinked hard against the sting rising behind his eyes. Inside, Sarah smiled over the rim of her tea. "Do you remember," she said, her voice low, "when we used to draw letters in the mud behind the chicken coop? I would teach you what I learned from the white children's books when the mistress wasn't looking." He chuckled, his laugh deep and rumbling. "You always insisted E stood for Elias. I thought you were making that up." "I wasn't," she said. "I needed to remember who you were." And now, as twilight stretched long across the fields, Elias finally understood this school wasn't just a building. It was memory made manifest. It was promise turned into action. It was in every way that mattered a battle won. But battles didn't end just because you planted a flag. They waited in the dark. And so he kept watch. Autumn arrived without announcement, slipping in on the backs of chilled morning winds and the subtle goldening of leaves that clung stubbornly to trees lining the fields beyond the schoolhouse. The days grew shorter, but not the burdens. Though the threats had quieted, Elias knew better than to relax. Hatred didn't always come with shouts or fire. It often crept like a shadow, finding new forms and new weapons. One afternoon, while Sarah was teaching a lesson on vowels, a soft commotion stirred near the back of the room. A boy named Josiah, small, with nervous hands and eyes that flickered like they were always scanning for exits, sat frozen, staring down at the floor. His slate had fallen to his side, his knuckles white against the edge of the bench. Sarah paused. The room held its breath. Elias moved first, crouching beside the boy, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "What is it, son?" Josiah didn't answer. His lips trembled. And then, barely audible, he said, "They killed my daddy last night." The words settled like dust across every surface, quiet and suffocating. Elias stood slowly, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Sarah dismissed the class early that day. No one protested. Grief, even when not your own, has a way of unraveling the seams of a room. That night, Josiah curled on a cot inside the schoolhouse, too afraid to return home. Sarah sat beside him, rubbing his back in slow, steady circles, humming something soft that didn't have words. Elias stood by the window, the rifle close at hand, but untouched, his eyes fixed on the distance. "I don't understand," Sarah murmured. "What are we teaching them if the world outside doesn't change?" Elias didn't answer right away. He was thinking of the war of the fields, where men like him had bled for freedom, only to come home to fences that still locked them out. He was thinking of letters written to ghosts, of promises that tasted like rust. "We're not just teaching them letters," he said finally, his voice low and sure. "We're teaching them how to carry themselves, how not to disappear." The next morning, Elias stayed after class and gathered the older children beneath the oak tree out back. He told them stories not of glory or medals, but of fear and survival. of how he had once stood in a trench in Virginia with nothing but mud and memory to keep him alive. He told them about men who cried in the dark and sang in the morning, not because they had hope, but because they refused to surrender their voices. One of the girls, quiet and sharp-eyed, raised her hand. "Were you ever afraid you'd forget who you were?" Elias nodded. "Every day." "And what did you do?" He looked at her, then at the others, all watching with faces too young to bear so much. "I remembered my sister's voice. I remembered that I came from something, even if they tried to bury it." Sarah watched from the schoolhouse steps, arms crossed the wind, catching her skirt and pulling strands of hair across her face. For all her strength, she too carried scars that didn't show. But in that moment, watching Elias speak life back into children, cracked by a world too cruel for their years, something in her eased. Later that week, Elias asked her to come with him to a place he hadn't visited since the day they were torn apart. The old plantation was just a husk now. What hadn't rotted had been reclaimed by vines and silence. The main house was gone, burned in some forgotten skirmish, but the fieldstone foundation still remained. And there behind the collapsed chimney and the twisted remnants of a water pump stood the tree, the one they used to hide beneath during summer storms. Sarah stood quietly, her fingers brushing its bark. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The weight of the place was enough. Elias sat at the base of the tree legs, stretched out his back, resting against the familiar curve of the trunk. "I used to dream about this spot," he said, "in the camps when things got bad. I'd picture you here, braiding grass into crowns, laughing like nothing could touch us." She knelt beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "I stopped letting myself remember." "I know," he said gently. "That's how we survived." For a long time they stayed like that, neither speaking, neither needing to. The wind carried the scent of earth and smoke and something older than memory. When they rose to leave, Sarah took one last look at the tree. "We didn't get to bury our parents," she said. "We never had a grave." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief, the one with the faded initials, and tied it gently around a low branch. "Let this be it," then he said. "Let this be where we put down what we lost." And with that, they turned back toward the school, not to forget, but to finally begin. In the days that followed their return from the ruins of the plantation, something shifted, not in some grand cinematic way, but in the quiet rhythm of life that no longer buckled under the weight of silence. The past had not vanished, nor had it been resolved, but it had finally been given a place to rest. And in doing so, Elias and Sarah began to walk differently, not with lightness exactly, but with the kind of steadiness that comes from having looked your ghosts in the eye and survived them. Autumn deepened. The children came bundled in hand-me-down coats and mismatched scarves, their breath visible in the early hours, their hands chapped but still eager to turn pages, trace letters, and dream out loud. Inside the schoolhouse, the air was warm with wood smoke and chalk dust. The old stove, coaxed back to life by Elias each morning, pulsed with a gentle heat that made the room feel like a world apart, one untouched, if only temporarily, by the cruelty that waited beyond its walls. Elias took on more and more of the day-to-day tasks. He read stories aloud during lunch breaks, sharpened pencils with a pocket knife, repaired benches that sagged under too many small bodies. The children had taken to calling him Uncle Elias, not out of habit but affection. He wore the title like a second name, not loud or proud, just constant. One afternoon, Sarah sat grading a stack of essays when a boy named Caleb approached his feet, hesitant on the wooden floor. He held out a folded paper, face flushed with nervous pride. "It's my composition," he said. "We were supposed to write about who we want to be." Sarah opened it and read, "When I grow up, I want to be like Uncle Elias. Not because he was a soldier, but because he came back. He keeps the fire warm and watches the door and never lets anyone feel alone." She didn't say anything at first. She couldn't. Instead, she looked up at the boy and managed a smile that trembled at the corners. "You're already more than halfway there," she whispered. That evening, Elias read the composition himself. He sat on the porch afterward, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the stars just beginning to appear through the thinning clouds. "I didn't come back to be anyone's example," he said when Sarah joined him, cup of tea in hand. "No," she replied, settling beside him. "You came back to find me. And because you did, they get to believe in something more." He turned to her then, and for a long moment neither spoke. Words felt too small for what had taken root between them, not just a bond reforged, but a legacy beginning to grow. They had walked through fire, yes, but they had carried others out with them. Winter crept in slowly, frost dusting the edges of the fields, turning the schoolyard into a place where boots crunched and breath lingered in the air like prayer. And still the children came, with cracked slates and tattered books and hungry minds. They came, and one morning they came to find the doors locked. Elias had not lit the fire. Sarah found him still, the blankets pulled high, his face as calm as a man who had finally, after a lifetime of keeping watch, given himself permission to rest. He had passed in the night, no struggle, no pain, just gone like a candle burning low until it flickered out in its own time. The funeral was held beneath the old oak behind the school. Children and grown men wept alike. Sarah spoke only once, her voice clear and steady. "He kept his promise," she said. "He came back. And because he did, all of this exists." A year later, the school was renamed the Carter Freedom School. Above its doorway, carved into wood with a care usually reserved for holy things, was the phrase, "Knowledge is the light that outlives us." And every morning as children passed beneath that sign, they walked not just into a classroom, but into the promise of a man who returned from war, not to escape his past, but to build a future where others could be more than what the world told them they were born to be. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of keeping a promise. Thank you for watching and for carrying these voices forward.